If we as Christians are called to do what we can to show the love of Christ to society at large, how will we be able to do that 1 year, 5, 10 years from now in a culture that is increasingly hostile to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which for Christians includes the constitutional right to the free exercise of religion? We'll talk about that and even more tonight, so please stay with us. Thank you, and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to Ewtn Live, where we get to bring you guests from all over the world. Now, our guest tonight has been working to redirect local and national public policies back towards a respect for the dignity of the person, to affirm human life from conception to natural death, the union of one man and one woman as the natural definition of marriage, and the freedom to practice and proclaim religion. He advocates for these principles in the public square through rigorous scholarship, debate, and education. So please welcome the president of the American Principles Project, Mr. Frank Canon.
Glad to be with you.
Frank, it is a delight to have you here. Now, you're doing this on basic principles and stuff. Where is your organization?
Well, we're located about 4 blocks from the White House.
Okay.
So we'll be in the first ring of people that they go after.
Huh. Who's they? We'll figure that out at another time. We'll wait till court. But yeah, you're close. So you're in Washington.
Washington, D.C.
And would that be because you want to influence the various people in the political realm?
Yes. I mean, part of what our job is to affect national policy and to work with the members of Congress to see what they can do to protect life, liberty, religious freedom, etc. So it's good to be there with them.
Is this an arm of the Democrats or the Republicans or the Libertarians? Is any one party's arm?
No, and we were started, in fact, because there was, after the 2008 election, a sense that neither party was really getting to both the economic and social problems that were belaboring the country, that there was a distrust of Republican policies as they related to workers, and there was a distrust of Democratic policies as they related to cultural values. Mm-hmm. And what we tried to do is erect I think a conservatism that's very compatible with Catholic beliefs that kind of unify the value for the worker and the cultural values and institutions that support that person.
Yeah, I think that's important. I found the same problem. I have been critical of some of the moral statements by leaders of both parties. Mm-hmm. I don't care what party they belong to. Mm-hmm. If you are in favor of killing the unborn or the sick and elderly, I'm against you, and I'll call you out. And I've done it for Republicans and Democrats alike. We have to be Catholics first. It'd be my principle. Would you be against that?
No, it's absolutely true that there are two different, take abortion, two different sins against the unborn child. One is the sin of active promotion of abortion. the other sin is silence and capitulation. And that sin can often be worse because so many people have put their faith in a politician or in a policymaker to do what's right, and pressure comes down, and that person avoids their responsibility and hurts that unborn child.
Yeah. And it's so, because you also hear a lot of politicians say, personally, I'm against abortion, but it's now the law of the land, which it's not really. It's a decriminalization by the Supreme Court, not written law. As far as I understand, it'd be, mildly technical as a non-lawyer can. So, this is something that we have to say, wait a second. There are a lot of things people do within the realm of the law that are still not good, such as ways to get around paying taxes or whatever it might be that you would disagree with. Stand up, and try to change the attitudes of politicians.
Well, first of all, the Supreme Court has been spectacularly wrong on race relations, going back years and years.
Well, no, 1856 with Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson.
Separate but equal.
Right.
Yeah. So, and we've learned as a nation that the moral values really have to be reasserted by the political system against an overreach or mistake by the Supreme Court.
Right.
And that's our job right now. And it's going to be our job with life, and it's going to be our job with marriage, and I think it'll be our job increasingly, unfortunately, with religious liberty questions.
And it's important to remember, I urge people, you can go to the government website and make a copy in your computer of the Dred Scott decision. See the evil things said about people who are black and of African origin, that the Supreme Court said that they are inherently inferior. Now, that kind of court has to be, corrected.
Well, one of the historical facts that people really don't focus on is that Lincoln rejected the idea that that was a law that informed all other public policy after that. Right after Dred Scott was ruled, the Congress of the United States actually voted to outlaw slavery in the District of Columbia. And they did it because they thought the sovereign will of the people, as expressed by their elected representatives and the president, trumped a kind of narrow Supreme Court decision. And after the Civil War, Congress was given the duty in the 14th Amendment, the duty, not just the right, but the duty to make questions of civil rights their responsibility. So when you're talking about unborn children and the fundamental right to life, there is no bigger constitutional question of a civil right than, and in my opinion, that Congress ought to be addressing.
As a matter of fact, again, I think it's worth, because you can find this online, I have, read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, how Lincoln helped start the Republican Party because the Whigs were not really standing up the way they should for these issues. And in those days, the Democrat Party under Stevens were saying that you have to follow what the Supreme Court said. And so Lincoln is saying, no, the issue of the pursuit of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as given by the Creator trumps the Supreme Court. And Douglas was saying the other, that no, Supreme Court trumps. This is still the tension we're living with.
Well, the irony is that when the Republican Party was formed, there were two big questions, slavery and polygamy. So we were talking about who is a human being protected by our laws, and then the second part is, what is marriage?
Right.
And what does it mean? And the irony is that that challenge of defining what is marriage and what is a human being hasn't gone away. In fact, it's sharpened, and I would argue is a central obligation of politics to address today.
Yeah, and it's changed somewhat, though apparently polygamy is returning because this is an issue that's being brought up not by Mormon breakoff
right.
groups.
Right.
There's some Mormon breakoff groups that still apparently
Right.
allegedly practice polygamy, but now it's being brought up as a possibility in California of having 3, 4, 5 members of a marriage. So this is basically legalizing the various affairs people are having into an institution. So it's coming back. Plus, is marriage between a man and a woman
Well,
exclusively?
yeah, in the Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision of, I think it was 93, there was the quote that really, I think, gets at the heart of this, which is, reality, according to Justice Kennedy, is what people believe that it is. And how they see their own happiness is what the Constitution should be all about helping to achieve. And it's a radically different view of reality than Catholics and Orthodox Christians hold, which is that reality has been unchanged over the course of the entire period of time, and that self-restraint rather than self-indulgence is at the core of human happiness.
Mm-hmm. See, that's something that the founders were warning about during the Constitutional Convention. As they're starting to write, you see them say, either you will have your morality inside you and get it from the Bible, or you will have your morality forced on you at the end of a bayonet. That's one of the early framers was saying that. So there's where do we find that reality? How do you help people to think through the issue of knowing what is the truth and reality of morals?
Well, I think that there is a philosophical component, and there also is a practical component. One of the greatest things about natural law, as God gives it to us, is that it is natural, meaning that people instinctively react to it, so that the arguments for truth and the evidence for truth and what you can find through social sciences all back up traditional one man, one woman marriage as it is the best vehicle for raising children and transmitting values from generation to generation. And there's all kinds of evidence to that. You have to be willful to actually try to ignore that kind of evidence.
As a matter of fact, if folks want to get some of that evidence, a very easy way, it's a little bit outdated, things have gotten worse since then, but in 1993, in the Atlantic Monthly, April edition, I believe, there's an article called Dan Quayle Was Right. If you type that in, Dan Quayle Was Right, and just list the studies
absolutely
of, it's not about Dan Quayle or his politics.
No, right.
It's about, does single mother family structure help kids, hurt them, or is it neutral? And it turned out to be very, very much difficult and harmful for the majority of people.
But you have, even in the area of social science now, a desire to suppress real social science. Mark Rignaris of Texas did a study, extremely rigorous study, did it for a periodical that was peer-reviewed. And
which means that other
scholars who don't agree with him say his methodology was solid.
Right.
He went ahead and analyzed whether children in mother-father families, single families, or in situations where one of their parents was involved in a gay relationship, how they self-described. Now, this is important. What they themselves described was their situation as it related to feelings of suicide, achievement, all kinds of social, and he found
measurable data.
Measurable data,
Right.
and it wasn't being observed by a third party, or people were self-selecting because they had a certain point of view. This was across a broad range of data. He found that children in families or situations where homosexuality was involved in their parents' relationship in one form and they were exposed to it, did worse than any other category that he was studying. They tried to drum him out of the University of Texas. The evidence...
Was that the one in Austin?
Yeah. The evidence is not what they wanted to respond to. They wanted to respond to the audacity of using social science to look at their premises and see whether they were right or not.
You know, I sure hope none of those people would ever criticize the Catholic Church for going after Galileo. I sure hope that they would.
Don't think any one of them ever has.
Yeah, huh?
Yeah.
Because it's the same thing. You know, if you say, well, we can't have that result, then it makes what the church did with Galileo. At least they just put him under house arrest, but let him continue to do his research. This guy's being drummed out.
Well, he survived so far, but the attacks have been vicious, and the next guy knows that there's going to be a cost, a potential loss of livelihood, hurt for their family if they were ever to take this on again.
Especially if you don't have tenure at the university.
Right. And I mean, you said something to me in just discussion earlier in which you said the best way to go against some of these premises of the people who is to reapply their premises back to themselves. You know, do you believe in free academic thought? This is supposed to be an absolute tenet. No, I don't. I don't believe in free academic thought if the conclusions of your free academic thought challenge my conclusions that are in accord with my own view of justice. Are you in favor of free speech? I'm a civil libertarian who wants free speech. Yes, I want free speech, but I want to decide what is outside the realm of acceptable speech and what is hate speech and hurtful speech. So in all of these cases, the very principles that are supposed to be undergirding the argument from the left are actually what they're violating as it relates to the church and to scholarship and to others who are defending traditional values.
I think along that line, it's very important for parents and recent high school grads and college students to be aware that in some universities, there's actually less academic freedom than you would have found in a lot of the medieval universities.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, you could argue and debate anything. You have to have your reasons, but follow logic, you know, on the debates. But you can debate pretty much anything.
Yeah.
That's not the case in some, like in this example.
No, there was a very interesting article by Rob Dreher on I think it's April 6th or 7th. So if anybody wants to look at that, he was talking to a law school professor, one of the highest rated law schools in the country. And the professor was talking about how they have a secret handshake. I wish I was joking about this. Among the professors, in order to be able to identify that they were fellow Christians. The sense of not belonging, the sense of putting your career in jeopardy, the sense of being brought up by charges of insensitivity, in order to speak truth, is really under savage attack. And I would recommend that people read this because I think it gives a firsthand view of all of the things this tenured professor is afraid to do at his law school.
Yeah, and this, by the way, is not something directed only at Catholics. It is against evangelical Protestants,
Absolutely.
Orthodox Jews, and I assume also, believing Orthodox Muslims. That this is something that, if you take your faith and the moral principles that come from it seriously, you have some trouble in academia.
Look, I think that there is an across the board elite attack on Orthodox faith of all denominations, Catholic, evangelical, Jewish, because it is the single bulwark, the single hedge against the idea that this worldview of absolute permissiveness is uniformly accepted.
Or what Justice Kennedy said, that reality is whatever people believe it is at the time.
Right.
Whereas religious people may disagree amongst themselves on various things, though in general they agree a lot more
right.
on a lot of these moral issues, because they're reflecting that reality is created by God.
Right. But one of the things I think, that's important, especially for Catholics, is that they realize that the Catholic Church itself is under more and more intensive attack. The more and more conservative the Catholic Church has been on doctrine. I don't mean politically conservative.
Right, no.
But outspoken.
Holding on to the faith because we believe the faith to be true. Yeah.
Right. I mean, read the Catechism and what it says about homosexuality. It's intrinsically disordered. Mm-hmm. You say that in a public debate, and you say, I believe that as a matter of faith, you will be savaged for weeks and weeks until you lose your job or whatever other position you're at, because there is nothing worse than having a judgment on a behavior that the left does not agree with.
And that even was something that affected a Catholic high school teacher at a Catholic high school.
Right.
Who said that on a private blog.
Right.
But was threatened with having her job taken away from her for defending the Catholic teaching, because apparently the school, I don't know all the reasons, but they didn't speak up. But it seems that they said, well, the culture might be right on this.
This is a teacher named Januzzi who listens to the Pope every day and tries to live out what she's encouraged to do by her faith. And one of the things she felt encouraged to do was to use social media to voice the tenets of the faith. And she's not a theologian, she's not a public speaker, and so she was inartful in the way that she described some of the savage attacks that have been made on people defending traditional marriage. And what happened was that there was a firestorm against this woman, and the threat of her never getting her job back again. And this is somebody who has currently, I think, 3 kids that she's trying to put through college. Mm-hmm. And this is happening at a Catholic school.
Right. So it's again, this is where the cultural disorder and difficulty enters within the life of the church, mm-hmm. as it has in the past.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Machiavelli was raised a Catholic, and he, used some of the cardinals and even Pope Alexander VI as a model for how to be Machiavellian. Mm-hmm. So, we have worldliness brought into the church, but we don't become afraid of it. We don't, some people act like Elmer Fudd when they get stunned by these things. Become Bugs Bunny yourself. Don't just sit there and get stunned into inaction. Stand up and learn how to put into words what must be said to defend the church, even from people within the church.
Look, I think one of the most one of the most scary elements of this to me is the lack of realization of how seriously the church itself is a particular target.
Yes.
The New York Times on Easter ran an article by Frank Bruni, a columnist, who said that that religions that hold homosexuality to be a sin must be compelled to change. Mm-hmm. Now, try to think about how far away from the American ideal it is to try to tell people what the tenets of their religion should be and how they should be applied. And President Obama has been very, very conscious of limiting religious freedom to the churches rather than to the public square. Very early on in his presidency, he started talking about freedom to worship.
Which is from the Constitution of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
The Constitution of the Soviet Union guaranteed freedom of worship, by which they meant keep your religion inside the church.
Public square.
Outside the church, you are going to the gulag. Mm-hmm. That was, well, they didn't say that in the Constitution, they just lived it out. But they did not have freedom of religion, they had freedom of worship. And also in the French Constitution, I think in the Third Republic.
Anything besides French food, I don't think we ought to be imitating in terms of constitutional principles. But
food's good.
Food's good. The key thing here, I think, is that that religion should influence the entirety of our lives. That's what we're called to do. We're called to act out the precepts that Jesus Christ laid out for us. And none of us live them perfectly. Mm-hmm. But it's our obligation to try to do that and to construct public policy and laws that reflect that. And in a democracy, we win sometimes, we lose sometimes. But we certainly ought to be not only allowed, but encouraged to take the full things that make us a human being and use that to inform our experience when we go out and debate public policy. And to reject that is to reject what fundamentally was different about America from the countries of Europe that all of the first Americans were escaping from.
And I think for us to understand that some of the politicians will act not necessarily out of conviction, but out of fear of losing their job. Mm-hmm. And fear of unpopularity. So a good example, Barack Obama running for the Illinois Senate signed a statement in favor of same-sex marriage. Barack Obama running for the U.S. Senate said marriage is between a man and a woman. Mm-hmm. 2008 running for the presidency in favor of a marriage between a man and a woman, and that's beyond his pay grade to discern. Then when he's running in 2012, after a lot of pressure from donors, he said, no, we're going to support gay marriage. And so it began with Joe Biden, and he moved to it a few days later. So, they do this because they think if I say it one way, I'll get elected here, but not here and not here. Well, and we need to be able to stand up and say, well, can I encourage you to not violate or attack my religious beliefs by making sure you know that I won't vote the way any of you politicians want to be. Let them experience that. They don't seem to have clear values. They go back and forth. So, let's encourage them and speak up.
Well, Ronald Reagan said it, I think, the most directly that I've heard it, which is, if you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat.
Yeah, and you know, and by the way, I mentioned him because this is a case that's up right now, but this is something that exactly applies to Republicans as well, libertarians. I mean, one of the candidates is advertising flip-flops on his website. Well, there's no accident, and so you know they will change on their policies, and that's why we cannot afford to sit back and, well, whatever they want to do, speak up, especially the laity.
Exactly.
That is the role of the laity.
Well, that's also why we established American Principles Project. We have a website that is a blog that we do daily called thepulse2016.com. And the latest pulse that we had up was an analysis of how the various candidates responded to the argument about the Religious Freedom Bill in Indiana. And what we have to be informed. We have to know who was willing to go out and speak publicly. And we have listed there what they said, so you can evaluate directly what they said. We have an expert in the field, Maggie Gallagher, who's been fighting for traditional marriage for years, who evaluated from her point of view what the various would-be candidates said. These are all Republicans, but the grades go from A+ to F, and it's important for you to know who in real time is getting out there and fighting, and to let those people who are fighting know that one of the reasons you support them is that they're willing to fight.
And to keep an eye on them as well. Are you going to go flip-flopping?
Right.
Are you going to, go with whatever seems to get you votes?
What do you say in one audience compared to another?
Exactly. And, to make sure that we first are consistent in our faith and morals. And then secondly, from the strength we have from what God has revealed to us and what our minds help us to think through about natural law, then on principle, call people in politics to be principled as well. Now, of course, I don't have confidence in that, but they will respond to votes and money. We have to respond to the timing. So we're going to take a little break. We'll come back in a couple of minutes and start dealing with some questions. So please stay with us. Thank you, and welcome back. First, I want to give a little bit of information about where our guest is, working. It's called the American Principles Project. If you are interested in finding out more about them, you can go to AmericanPrinciplesProject.org. AmericanPrinciplesProject.org. Or you can also call them 202-503-2010. Also, we would love to have you come down here to Sweet Home, Alabama. It is beautiful down here. Is it not beautiful? It has just been gorgeous, gorgeous weather. And we'd love to have you here with us. If you can make a pilgrimage, please call our pilgrimage department at 205-271-2966. Or you can go to the website ewtn.com. They will give you information about the scheduling of masses, of programs. You can be in the studio audience. They'll let you know places where you can stay, good places to eat. I haven't taken you to get any fried green tomatoes yet, but that place is just down the street. And barbecue, oh, we have some good barbecue down here. You know what to do with them when they're roasting. So come on down and join us. We'd love to have you with us. You ready for some questions?
Love to hear
Come on,
them.
let's giddy up. Start off with this young lady. Ma'am, where are you from?
Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Now, you said that is
Flood City.
City.
But no more floods anymore.
Good. Keep it that way.
Yes.
Yeah, that was that terrible tragedy of the floods, Johnstown flood where a dam broke.
All three of them were.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy. So what's your question?
I would like to know, is your group utilizing social media to its utmost to get your message out? It's important here.
I couldn't agree more with the idea that social media is the most valuable tool in the arsenal to get the message out, especially to young people and others who don't use traditional means of communicating. So we've started a blog, we have a Facebook page, we have all kinds of various tools that we use from the social media sphere to get the message out. But I think more and more conservative groups are following what really was the great insight of Mother Angelica, which is that technology ought to be the friend of truth.
Yes. In getting some good college grads, there's a great school you ought to check into called John Paul the Great University, where it's the whole program is oriented towards how to use the media. That's their main purpose, and hire some of those young people to come over there, because if you're like me, it's not easy to figure that stuff out.
Well, we've got great people. I got to be on your show.
Huh? Ain't that something?
We got the top people.
Then I guess it works.
Yeah, it works.
Let's go to another question. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Brooklyn, New York.
Good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And what's your question?
Chief Justice Roger Taney was a Catholic, so how did he react to the Dred Scott decision?
Well, I'll let you take a shot, and then I'll.
Tony was a Catholic, and which is unusual in those days because there was a lot of anti-Catholicism. But there was an ongoing debate among American Catholics with the papacy over the issue of slavery and the equal rights of Africans and other and native peoples here. Going back to Pope Eugene IV, back in 1436 or 37, when the African slave trade began, he condemned it under excommunication, and that was repeated especially by Pope Paul III, one of the strongest and best anti-slavery statements. That continued on, and in the 1800s, Pope Gregory was extremely strong, but the Catholic bishops who were already dealing with anti-Catholicism in this country were also saying to the president, I mean, they went to the president to say, no, it's okay. He's just talking about the slave trade. If you already had the slaves, it's okay. And a number of the bishops and theologians were trying to justify having the slaves, and so that there wouldn't be even more anti-Catholic reaction. Okay, while the Pope and the popes over the centuries were strong against it, Tani went with those who were not only, well, first of all, he was dealing with the Constitution, and interpreting it, which allowed slavery. He could not undo what the Constitution said in allowing slavery. It was a compromise at the Constitutional Convention to make sure the southern colonies did not, or then states, but the southern states stayed in the Union. And so he couldn't undo that. He thought, he didn't have the authority. Secondly, he was following the standard racism of the day. Later on, matter of fact, just generation, that same generation, Charles Darwin also taught that blacks are an inferior species in between the ape and the human. They're not humans. Darwin said that because of his theory of evolution, but also this was fairly commonly held. And Tawney was in that same mentality. So he wrote, or he voted with the Dred Scott decision. And I don't know enough about his personal life as to what he thought of it later on, but it did take a constitutional amendment to eradicate slavery, which it did after the war.
Well, the one thing, in God's providence, it was the Fugitive Slave Act, the idea that people in the North had to return free slaves as property that came from this view of the Tawney Court was, in fact, one of the things that ignited Northern opposition to slavery, because people were being coerced by the law into participating in slavery. People who had no slaves of their own were to report slaves, had a responsibility to return stolen property. And I think it's akin to the way in which in modern times there is such a strong opposition to the idea of using tax dollars for abortion.
Yes.
Because you go from somebody who's not a participant and staying outside the process, even if you dislike the process, to feeling the personal culpability of being part of that process. And I think it's part of the overreach that's happening on the abortion side that is helping pro-life to grow in the country.
And speaking of that overreach, was not some of that overreach on the abortion issue underlying the restoration of the Freedom of Religion Act to protect Christians from having to participate in abortion? And other, and in the case of some pharmacists who did not want to sell contraceptives, that this would protect their conscience. That wasn't that the purpose of the law originally?
Yeah, that was very much the purpose of the law. The law was to protect people who were engaged in commercial enterprise from engaging in or being forced to engage in activities that fundamentally violated the precepts of their faith, and to make government neutral as an actor in that. And it would apply to people on the other side of the debate. It would, somebody who, from a deeply held belief, religious belief, would not want to print an offensive T-shirt that attacked gay people. Right. Would not be forced to do that as a matter of conscience, and that would not violate any sense of public accommodation or public, it would not be a form of prejudice on the part of that T-shirt maker. And so, yes, conscience was, an abortion conscience was a big part of
that's why I remember there being a number of nuns there, and that Jewish printers would not be required to print out pro-Nazi things or racist things. I mean, everybody would be able to say, look, I am against that. So and I have to refrain, and just trying to protect that religious freedom. And I think, as I recall, the original Restoration of Freedom of Religion Act came from the federal government under Bill Clinton, in order to protect Yaqui Indians who smoked or ate peyote. I did not inhale, Bill Clinton. That was to prevent them from being deprived of something they considered an important part of their religion. That's how the original cause of that law.
There is a tolerance for everything but moral clarity.
Yeah, yeah.
As it relates to sexual license.
Yes.
That is the one area in which whoever is speaking in that, there's a special carve out for their religious rights to be attacked and separated. And if you don't think that's true, you just have to go look at what the compromise, in quotes, was in Indiana. There was a specific carve out as not being able to use this law as it relates to a sincere belief against of a photographer, for example, or bakery, or anybody else to be forced to participate in a gay wedding when they think that that's an affirmation of a service that they find fundamentally against the religious tenets.
And I find this very odd because there was a bakery in Colorado that refused to make a cake in the shape of a book that had the verses prohibiting homosexuality written on it. And the court defended their right not to make a cake that would say something against homosexuality. But somebody who doesn't want to participate, they are not defended. This is what I don't understand is how judicial principle is able to cover both of those situations.
Well, they have two different standings, and the reason for that is that if you have an equality right for a group of people, and you are defending their equality right against the liberty right, the freedom to act right by somebody else, and it fundamentally goes against equality, then they use that as the rationale for why it's a different set of actions.
I see. Okay.
Where they're allowed to use equality to trump your freedom of expression.
So quantifying equality trumps freedom of religion.
Freedom, yeah.
Or expression in general.
Well, yeah. This would happen to evangelical churches that, for example, had a prohibition against interracial dancing.
Right.
There was an equality right. The government said we can't allow you to have your tax exempt status. We can't do that. So you're free to have this, but we as a government are going to impose restrictions and take away benefits from you.
Okay. All right. Well, that clarifies the principle. Let's go to a question from the studio. Sir, where are you from?
Brooklyn, New York.
Good. Isn't that your hometown?
I was born at St. Catherine's Maternity Hospital in Greenpoint.
Oh.
So
I had a question for you. Now that the Supreme Court has taken up the issue of gay marriage, do you think that the court will rule that it's unconstitutional to prohibit it? And if the court does require that states allow gay marriage, what would happen, do you think, to the presumption of legitimacy in marriage?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The short answer is yes, they're going to outlaw traditional marriage, in my opinion.
Well, outlaw it or make it equal.
I'm sorry. They're going to make homosexual marriage equivalent to traditional marriage. What I was thinking about when I misspoke is what then happens. A lot of people say that religious liberty is where the pro-traditional marriage movement should move to. But because of what we were just talking about, the real high ground is the opposition to gay marriage initially. Once you have an equivalency, you've set up a group of people in the homosexual community whose rights need to be protected against any aggression against their equality. So you've set up a situation now where there is no ground in between where we can go to, meaning people of traditional religious faith, and secure a right to express our religion against. So tax exemption status gets called into question.
Sure.
Accreditation of schools get called into question. Legitimacy of governments working with Catholic charities get called into question. And none of this relates to anything but the maintaining of a traditional view of homosexuality as sin, which is seen as fundamentally attacking the equality rights of the homosexual community. And that's where I'm afraid this is headed.
Yeah, and you hear people talking this through. For instance, as of now, priests, ministers, and rabbis are agents of the state in performing marriages, and that we are recognized as legitimate ministers of marriage. We sign the marriage certificate as an official statement for the state registry and send it back for the county in which the marriage takes place. And that we just may simply have to say we won't do that anymore. We will not be agents of the state in doing marriage. And the state doesn't pay us for that. That's not, we just do that and take care of it. We'd be the equivalent of a justice of the peace. And if that's the case, then we'll just have to say, well, we cannot be a state agent. That might be where we have to go, and simply say, you have to get your marriage by a justice of the peace, and then come to Mass for the sacrament of matrimony.
Look, this attack began in cities a while ago, and the consequences of it become very dramatic as it's played out. San Francisco has been an incubator for a lot of these the regulations and rules that come from elevating homosexual lifestyle to an equality right. In San Francisco, the largest AIDS hospice was run by the Salvation Army. But there was a city ordinance that said that any provider of services in the city, any business in the city, needed to offer same-sex partnership benefits. The Salvation Army, which is in itself a church, said
it's its own denomination.
It's its own denomination. Said this violates the tenets of our church. They said, "I'm sorry, we don't care. Close down your hospice."
Right.
And if people don't see the inherent danger to specifically Catholic institutions, because they're organized hierarchically,
right,
rather than our atomized churches that are independent, they become the principal target for the application of these lawsuits.
Yes. And this is something that, we are definitely going to have to be very alert to, because these things do have great ramifications. And, like we've done with, dealing with adoption. We had to close down in many states because of it. Again, it's the American Principles Project. AmericanPrinciplesProject.org is where you can go, or call them at 202-503-5333. 2101. I want to thank you very much for being here with us, and I want to give you a blessing as well. May Almighty God bless you and keep you and cause His face to shine upon you. May He lead you in all of your ways by His peace. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
And you know, we can present these programs and all the other shows that we do and have guests to discuss important issues and teach us only because of you. You make this program possible and this network possible. Please keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill so we can pay our bills.